And before we do the final nomination of the winner of today's startup pitches, just very brief fireside chat with these two great gentlemen who traveled such a long way from San Francisco to be here with us. Please give them applause. And the reason I wanted, that's going to be just a 15 minutes conversation. The reason I wanted to talk to you guys, because you're kind of like pushing the borders on creating a better world and more opportunities in emerging markets. But actually also interested in your personal story. This is Vinny, Lingham, Bill, Barhydt. Guys, how did you come to do what you're doing?
Good. Well, I grew up as an entrepreneur, serial entrepreneur, in South Africa. So I was born in South Africa in 1979. It's kind of during the height of the apartheid era. Being of Indian origin, I was in the non-white camp, and then you had the white camp back in apartheid. And so it was very interesting because I lived through that era up until 1991 when Mandela was released from prison. And then the country went through a transformation period in '94 where we had our first democratic election. And so what I found interesting was just watching how people who have been oppressed for decades were lining up literally down streets and roads to go vote at the elections in '94. You may have seen some of the media coverage back then. But we're talking about 3 days worth of lines to go vote because the country...
3 days.
3 days.
3 days.
Yeah, 3 days. It was 3 days worth of voting. And people would be camped out and lying because, if you've been in an oppressive regime for 40 or 50 years and you finally get democracy, something you've been sort of dreaming about and going through a very difficult crisis in a period in our country. We had somewhat like some semi-civil war, I would say, a couple of bad incidents. And, it was tough. It was tough growing up as a kid, witnessing some of this. But... I think it was very interesting to see how deeply passionate people were for freedom and democracy, and literally willing to stand 3 days in line to vote. So, fast forward to today, I've started a number of companies. Civic's my fourth or fifth company, depends how you count them. And one of the things that we're trying to do is build a system for. We started off, the name Civic came from the idea of civic participation, civic duty, and voting being an important part of that. And so the use case my co-founder and I came up with was, we believe that blockchains were very well suited to voting. And so the reason for that being is you can't double count a token. You can't have double votes. So if you attach each token to an individual and you said, okay, you can vote for a political party, you can send one coin to this address or this address, you could tabulate the results in real time. There wouldn't be some of the election snafus you still get today in the world, and you could move to a mobile democracy where people could vote in real time on their phones in the privacy of their homes. And this is like a 20 or 30-year vision, but in building out that vision, we came to the conclusion that the reason this is not happening is that governments don't trust the digital identity systems out there today. Spent a lot of time chatting to governments in San Francisco and Sacramento, in California, and you'd expect these guys to be the most progressive in the world. And for them, it was like, well, we can do an internet voting trial in 5 or 6 or 7 years' time, which is not a very good timeline for a startup. So we didn't think that the idea of going for voting in the short term was a good one, but by digging into the roots of why they weren't allowing it was just really, the question always was, how do we know that's you at the other end of the phone? So we figured, okay, well, let's build a digital identity system where we know how to verify, validate ID credentials, and ensure that when somebody is voting from their phone, they can authenticate using the on-device features like Touch ID, Face ID, whatever else comes up in the future, Retina ID, and then layer that on with credentials which are stored on the phone, secured by the blockchain, and then you could have digital democracy. So that's kind of the short, fast-forwarded version of where I got to today.
Great, thank you. Bill, what about you?
Sure. So I guess I would say the common thread from my working life has been this weird combination of cryptography and capitalism. I'll tell you a story. I think we talked about this at another discussion we did together. a few months ago, but I don't tell the story very often. I was recruited by the CIA when I was 19. And the reason is, if you remember, if those of you over 40, we had this embassy we built in Moscow. It was a deal that Carter did with the Soviets in the 70s. The Soviets negotiated a great deal where their workers were going to build not only the embassy in DC, but their workers were going to build the embassy in Moscow, which turned out to be not so good of an idea. Because once they were ready to move in and they went in and did their tests, every 8 or 9 inches there were bugs in the concrete. And so at that point, in the mid-'80s or late '80s, they realized that regardless of how this was being done, that they shouldn't just be dependent upon the security of the building, but the security of the information itself. And so they hired this team that I was part of that was trying to look at kind of global messaging and cryptography, believe it or not, for the first time. But I mean, real digital, at the time mainframe-based, but real digital cryptography. And so that was my real first exposure to that. And it turned out that I ended up becoming later a quant at Goldman in fixed income. The term quant didn't exist at the time. And had exposure to all kinds of derivatives. And if you listened to the talk earlier that I gave about how our smart contract stuff works, totally related to that. Actually, 25 years later, I felt like, hey, we're actually able to use a lot of this fancy derivative stuff to help consumers in emerging markets. And then at Netscape worked on SSL and X509 standards. And so I had this progression of my strong belief in access to capitalism kind of being the tide that raises all boats, and cryptography kind of being the backbone that enables kind of personal liberty and freedom, to the point where I've kind of labeled it crypto-capitalism now, which is actually a working title for a book I'm releasing, hopefully late this year, on this topic. And so really my mission, personal mission, is to build a framework that enables people globally to participate in capitalism regardless of whether it's the farmer in Ghana who wants to invest in Apple, I think was the example I used this afternoon, or somebody who needs to send money, or somebody in Zurich who wants to buy access to altcoins. I want it to be a single global banking system, almost the unbank, and I think cryptography is the ultimate enabler of that. But really, I would say that's the common thread now in my life, is those kind of two worlds have come together for the first time with ABRA.
Yeah, well, hopefully you stay in one world.
Yeah.
It's funny because I also had this job offer from KGB as I got scholarship from Germany.
Is it an offer? Is it an offer, or is it more of a friendly show up at this
invitation.
time? I see. Yeah.
But I didn't took it. Yeah. And the proof is that I was working at UBS. Right. But basically, that's interesting story. And guys, if you would put, the pecking order, like in which area this technology is gonna really solve one of the biggest problems in developing markets, right? Like we are talking about this now for years. We're saying, that technology is enabling this transformation of societies there. That we're leapfrogging, right? Like for example, like in developing countries, people never had a landline. They came from having no phone to having smartphone, right? And the same is going to happen in a lot of areas. But if you would put by the size of the impact, which implementation of the blockchain technology is going to really solve the problem in developing countries?
Well, I'm biased. I mean, I'm quite certain that the answer is access to capitalism via these new first-generation cryptocurrencies. I say new because it's less than 10 years old, right? The internet, commercial internet, is 25 years old. And I think that is probably the single best tool beyond the smartphone itself for enabling access to capitalism that I've ever seen. And it's all the examples that I talked about earlier. I don't think it's enterprise blockchain. There may be applications for that are interesting, but I do think that when it comes to really having a tide that will raise all boats, it is access to capitalism, and I think that it will be enabled by building the unbank, which is enabled by this cryptocurrency technology for sure.
Totally with you. Vinny, what about you?
I mean, personally, I think it's payments and identity. Those are the two areas. I think there's a huge swath of unbanked customers in Africa and the rest of the world. I invested in a company called Valor and they basically are working to start giving banking services to the unbanked in emerging markets using their cryptocurrency dollar. And you know, the market opportunity is just so big. You know, the cost of transactions in Africa, and I'm guessing most emerging markets, is really high. It's like 10%. People don't realize sending money, remittances from anywhere in the world to Africa is at least a 10% fee for if you can put it in the hands of the unbanked. And they have to stand in lines at like Western Union. It's a very, very expensive battle. And I think when we can reduce those costs of transactions for the unbanked, and the same way that Africa leapfrogged the rest of the world with mobile telecommunications over fixed line, is kind of the same thing with the unbanked market. People think that it's about getting the unbanked to be banked. It's not. It's more like getting the unbanked to do something else, because they're not going to fall into the traditional banking structures and the banking ecosystem. So giving them alternative ways of financing their goods, their homes, there was, I think it was you telling us the story about the appliances. Mm-hmm. I mean, you might want to tell that story, but there's alternative ways to give them financial services which don't incorporate banking.
Yeah, so just to build on that, I can actually name 3 applications of cryptocurrency specifically that enable financial services within what you're calling the unbanked community. I would call just kind of the global community that can't be done any other way. So the first I alluded to this afternoon, which is what I call decentralized investing. Decentralized investing, and that's, again, somebody in Africa being able to invest in Apple stock, right? As of last week, we enable investing in altcoins and cryptocurrencies, but the technology is 100% the same. And using smart contracts tied to Bitcoin, it ultimately is a payment, as Vinny said, but it's hidden in the background. It's what I call TCP/IP for money. And so that's one. The second is it's basically using this synthetic currency model to enable global payments and with no banks. Right now, obviously, the remittance market works today. You have remittances, you have SWIFT, you have services like PayPal. The other services are all arbitrage on banks because they just use banks to settle. But it's impossible to eliminate the banks from the equation today until crypto. So now with crypto, you can actually do person-to-person payments in a way that is physically the proverbial 2 tin cans with a string in the middle with no banks. And that crunches the fees to as close to 0 as you can get away from the 10% that Vinny mentioned. And the third example that I love is something related to why Foxconn invested in ABRA, which is the gadgets that Vinny mentioned, is what I call consumer asset finance. And this is also something I believe can't be done without crypto. So there's a first-gen version of this that's running in like Kenya and Tanzania, which is people getting solar lanterns for free that become their electricity and lighting for the first time. And then they make a monthly or weekly lease payment through their M-Pesa wallet. Now that works well in those countries because 1, everybody has M-Pesa, and 2, the cellular IoT connectivity is very cheap. But what if you could do that in dishwashers, washing machines, refrigerators, for the 3 billion consumers who can't afford to buy those devices outright or can't get access to credits, by embedding not only the IoT connectivity, but by embedding a wallet that would allow you to pay in rupees or rupiah, but actually do the settlement over crypto using the model I talked about earlier via smart contracts. That's actually totally doable today. So you would buy the refrigerator in Indonesia, and Samsung or LG would receive the payment in won in Korea via crypto channels with no banks, and would have no idea what currency the consumer paid in, and it would actually be real-time settlement. And if they don't make the payment, the device simply doesn't go on. So all 3 of those businesses represent a multi-trillion-dollar economy that cannot be accomplished, in my opinion, without this new cryptocurrency technology.
That's true. There are a lot of examples like that. I totally agree. For example, what do you guys think about national cryptocurrencies? You know, in those countries, starting from failing states to like a lot of, really countries of the third world, let's say. One of the biggest problems is that state is even not able to collect taxes because they don't know where the people are. There are no means to collect taxes, right? They don't collect taxes. They have no money to build schools and so on and so on. How about if we tokenize their national currencies, like what kind of transparency and accessibility of this money how that will impact the development of those countries?
Yeah, look, I think it's one of the powers of the state is the ability to issue money, right? So it kind of flies in the face of it that they would go and create a cryptocurrency where they would have self-imposed restrictions on the issuance of money. Now, I can see a world where, as an experimentation, a state issues a digital sort of equivalent of their currency, called a digital dollar type equivalency. But the real question is how is it mined? How is it centralized? Can they change the rules? Can they increase the inflation rate? How is it? Just because it's digital doesn't mean it changes form in terms of what the ability to inflate the money supply. So this is
transparency, right?
Well,
what's going on?
Define transparency.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, like
who's running the nodes? Who's validating the transactions? Yeah. Is there KYC on everyone? I mean, can you imagine a situation where you have a state issuing money, forcing through a smart contract that this money can only be transferred between people who have their IDs registered to certain wallets? Now they're tracking every single transaction that you're doing. How where you're paying? Like today, you go and spend $20 buying a bottle of wine. No one knows about it. It's cash. You can do that with Bitcoin, Monero, Zcash, etc. If you are paying with a state-based cryptocurrency, they're tracking every single purchase you're doing, where the money's going. It's kind of creepy.
Yeah, and I think the more we move into the world of national cryptocurrencies, the more important the post-national currencies will become.
It's inevitable that the states are going to issue their own money. Whether it succeeds or not in terms of adoption remains to be seen.
And whether there's actually inherent value versus the way things work today with paper and banks. I mean, maybe the one biggest advantage of a national cryptocurrency is the fact that paper money is just disgusting, right? I mean, if you actually examine what's on a piece of paper under a microscope, it is pretty nasty. But our government's going to give up, the rights to know what you did with that money vis-a-vis what happens with a real paper-bearer instrument. I don't see it happening. Are they going to give up the right to inflate the value or the supply of money such that the value of what you already own goes to zero, like the right they have today? I don't see that happening. So then the question becomes, what's the inherent value of having a government-issued and managed cryptocurrency versus the way things are today? It may be incrementally better because they don't have to print paper, but at that point, my reaction is, talking about your Bitcoin socks is more interesting. So.
It's the last topic to pick up here.
If you just add to it, if you look at like out of all the nearly 200 countries in the world, how many countries today are not running in a budget deficit?
Not many.
I'm guessing it's like in the teens maybe, somewhere around there. So these countries, if they issued a currency where they couldn't inflate their way out of troubles, they would have a serious problem.
Well, they could just change the protocol. They could, it's all in their hands, right?
What would their motivation be?
And the other topic is like this, and this is the last point for this. The other big present problem is that around 80% of land and real estate in developing countries is not registered, right? Like you have no rights, you have no title. Yes, you live there, but you can't even prove that it's yours. And you can't do anything with it, right? You can get a mortgage or some financing for your house, right? And there have been a lot of conversation about putting land registry and real estate on the blockchain. Maybe you mentioned some interesting examples, and what do you think about it?
Yeah, so I'm an advisor to Propi. They did one of the first real estate transactions out there using a blockchain. And there are so many companies in this space working with this. I think that's one of the biggest opportunities right now is that I think governments are willing to experiment with land registry. Hernando de Soto wrote a book, Mystery of Capital, where he talks about how to unlock capital sitting in the hands of people. Give them title to their property, allow them to use that title to finance their business or whatever it is. And so I think there's a big push towards unlocking the capital that's sitting in property owned by people who don't have title. And even then, if you look at property transfers, scams like title insurance, which we pay for in the US. In the US, when you buy a home, you can pay title insurance just to guarantee that the person you're buying the home from actually owns the home. It's this very weird concept. So these are the sorts of things which I think will be disrupted pretty quickly by blockchain. Okay, and with that, I would say thank you very much, Vinny Lingham, Bill Barhydt. Thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.